the Darbar Hall. The festival brochure and flyer are both available for purchase at our information desk outside near the main entrance. We are delighted to introduce the changing axis, India, South Asia, and the world. This session, as you saw, is presented by Amar Ujala. The political, economic, strategic, and cultural dimensions that emerging Asian nations are sharing, and undeniably are facing, have a lot to do. But how are these emergent forces, intra-Asian dynamics, and external powers likely to unfold with the future of global architecture? Vijay Gokhale, Bruno Maçães, Mahfuz Anam, and Jyoti Malhotra, in conversation with TCA Raghavan, discussed the evolving world order and visions for the future. Mr. Vijay Gokhale joined the Indian service in 1981, and his diplomatic assignments included Hong Kong, Hanoi, Beijing, New York, and Taipei. Gokhale has been India's High Commissioner to Malaysia, Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, and the People's Republic of China. Mr. Bruno Maçães is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies, and a former politician in Portugal. He's the author of several books on international affairs, a regular commentator on international media, and advises some of the world's leading companies on geopolitics and technology. Mahfuz Anam is the co-founder of the Daily Star, Bangladesh's leading English daily, and is its editor-publisher from 1993 till date. He worked for UNESCO in Paris, New York, and Bangkok, and was a member of the Mukti Bahini. He joined Bangladesh's regular army and was trained by the Indian Army at Murti, West Bengal. Jyoti Malhotra has been a journalist for more than 35 years and currently works as a consulting editor with The Print. She anchors 2 video shows on Indian politics and foreign affairs. Malhotra has worked with several media in a variety of languages, both in India and abroad, including the Indian Express, the Times of India, and BBC. Dr. TCA Raghavan, our moderator today, has retired from the Indian Foreign Service and is a former High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore. He's the author of 3 well-received books, including The People Next Door, the curious history of India's relations with Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, a huge round of applause for our panel today, and may we please begin the session.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to be here. So many friends in the audience. May I begin by saying how very grateful I am to Namita Gokhale, Sanjay Roy, and William Dalrymple, the festival directors, for inviting us. And it's wonderful to be back to the JLF in a new setting. Very happy to be part of this wonderful panel to discuss South Asia and the world in terms of what's happening all around us. And it's also wonderful for me to be in a position to ask questions of Jyoti Malhotra. So let me begin with you, Jyoti. You would have noticed that in South Asia, we seem to have a slightly more nuanced view, or a slightly different view in terms of what is happening in Ukraine as compared to the dominant Western narrative. So somewhat unusually, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka all abstained, voted together in abstaining on a resolution in the UN General Assembly condemning Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. So what does this mean? I mean, do you think we are more cynical about the rhetoric of principle which comes out of Europe and North America about what Russia is doing after Iraq and Libya and so on? Or are there more serious geopolitical reasons as to why these countries have taken a different stand?
Thank you so much, Raghavan, and thank you to the Jaipur Literature Festival for having us all here. It's fantastic just to rejoin the normal world, I think, after 2 years of sitting inside our homes. So it's really wonderful. And apart from all the friends in the first row, I want to say thank you to Preeti Balunda, my friend from MGD. We went to school in Jaipur, so we're back home in a sense. So to your question, I think it was really interesting when India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka abstained at the UN Security Council on the Ukraine vote. And I think the reason for that is, I think why this is interesting is because India at least looks at the Russia-Ukraine crisis very differently from that from the way Europe and the US looks at it. And I know a lot of people in Delhi, in analysts, like perhaps some in this room, believe that it's India's dependence on Russian arms that is forcing us to vote in a certain way. But I beg to differ actually on that front. I do think that there is huge discomfort amongst Indians, a lot of disquiet about the fact that the Russians have bombed innocent civilians. A children's hospital a couple of days ago was also bombed. A few children died. And I think just the fact that innocent people are being killed in this war, and it's not their fault at all. But I think perhaps one of the reasons why India has voted in this different way is because I think what Russia offers and what the former Soviet Union offered is the idea of the alternative. You know, you don't want to be completely in the US-led camp, or you don't want to be in the China-led camp. And while there is, again, a lot of talk about Russia being the junior partner of the Chinese, we can go into that later. But the idea of the alternative, the middle path, or the third way that the Russians offer or the former Soviet Union offered, especially in international fora like the UN Security Council, I think that is something that India draws succor from. And it's so easy to be dismissive of the fact that India is supportive of Putin's war. I don't think India is supportive of Putin's war. I think India very much is very uncomfortable about Putin's war, and that's the difference between this being, Vladimir Putin's war. It's not Russia's war in that sense. And also we recognize that, when I say we, I mean India, I think recognizes that, Putin has been around for 22 years. Of course, he gets elected every 4 or 5 years, but he has been around for 22 years. And in that sense, the idea of the democratic spirit perhaps hasn't percolated down as much as we find in India. I mean, we've just been through 5 state elections, very, very, competitive and very well fought elections. So we understand that. But having said that, I think it's the idea of the alternative that India is sort of attaching itself to. And while every successive abstention in the various forms, whether the Security Council or the Human Rights Council at the General Assembly, have been also leavened by the fact that dialogue must be the answer. But I think in my view, I think it's right that India continues to abstain on this matter.
Well, that's true. India is uncomfortable, but I think everyone is uncomfortable with the war, including possibly President Putin himself. So let me ask you, Mahfuz Anam, what do you think? Do you think this is do you think that most South Asians feel that this is a tussle within Europe? It's a North Atlantic NATO-Russia issue. We don't see any great point of principle involved. So why get involved?
Well, very clearly speaking, in the recent past, if there has been a single instance of aggression, of meaningless invasion of another country, of having no justification for a big power to jump on its small neighbor, Putin's or Russian invasion of Ukraine is one of them. I mean, there is absolutely no justification. I mean, Russia can have issues of security, but it has made it known in public. But before you invade a country, there are so many other steps you can take, and Putin did not. And in the instance of such a naked aggression, for people to have nuanced position, I think is a reflection of the cynical world we have come into. I think Bangladesh voted to abstain. I think it was immoral. I think India's abstention is immoral. But funnily, you have for the first time, maybe I'm wrong, that Pakistan, India, and China, they're on the same side of the fence. I mean, incredible achievement has been made. But it is all because we fail to take a moral position. Now, moral positions are sometimes looked up as funny. Oh, you are a moralist. In the international political world, you have to be realist. This distinction between morality and realism is one of the fundamental reasons for the troubles that we have in the world. That's my view. I think Russia should be wholeheartedly, unambiguously condemned for what it did. But Of course, there are different positions. And in South Asia, we do not subscribe to the Western view of Putin. We have our own ways of subscribing to it. We have our national interest. But here I would like to say that the definition of national interest also needs to be looked into by the civil society, by the writers, by the journalists, that how does a nation define its national interest? The nation does not. It is the power of the day, the government of the day, the ruling party of the day defines the national interest. How much the people of the country has a say in it, I have a lot of doubt. But answering your question, that yes, there is a South Asian cynicism for the Western interpretation of the attack by Putin. But within South Asia, I will say there are nuanced differences. I think India has a position, but Bangladesh being a smaller neighbor of a big country, we have also a different perception.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So clearly, civil society in South Asia feels somewhat differently. And I know, Vijay, you're no longer in the government, but do you agree that we should have taken a strongly moral position? Is there a moral issue involved at the core of this?
Thank you, Raghavan. I think there are two issues involved at the core of this. In the first place, is Russia's invasion of Ukraine going to upset the principle that you can use force to change borders and boundaries? After all, let us not forget that the borders of Ukraine were drawn up by the Soviet Union, and Russian Federation is the successor state. If that is the case, it has implications in South Asia, where borders were not drawn up by us, they were drawn up by a colonial power. The second issue, of course, is in this case where the larger power had certain ethnic interests across its border. Did the smaller power hold out on implementing the Minsk agreements and thereby, try to, the thing fell apart because they kept on wanting more, to the point that they pushed the larger power into an invasion? I think we have to look at these two principles. And therefore, I think that keeping this in mind, it was necessary to see how the situation evolved. Obviously, every government's first priority is to look after its citizens, and that it did. I think there's no doubt about what it did. I guess now, I'm sure within the government, they must be thinking on how to move forward. But I don't think that we took an immoral position when we abstained in the United Nations, because what happens in Europe does impact South Asia, but we have to look at the way it impacts us, and we can't just go on the situation on the ground in Europe. The history of Europe is very different from the history of South Asia.
The history of Europe is different. There's no doubt about that. And Bruno Maçães, to you, finally, to give us possibly a different perspective. You've heard these slightly different views, but let me ask you quite simply, is this a moral issue? Is this a point of principle involved, or is this a tussle which has been going on for some time, as Vijay Gokhale said? And now the narrative being spun around it is of a principle, but actually the issues are quite different.
There's a clear moral issue that's been very well described, speaker before, but there's not just a moral issue, there's also a political issue. But even there, I have to say that we in Europe find it difficult to understand India's position, and let me be honest and blunt about that. I did tweet after the vote that this was the beginning of the China-Pakistan-India alliance. It was a joke, but got me in a little bit of trouble on Twitter. But it was difficult to understand how China, India, and Pakistan are voting together. It was difficult for Europeans to understand why India is, whether being neutral, but sometimes a little closer to Russia, which is a dictatorship, and why it's not siding with Ukraine, a democracy. And if people have doubts about these classifications, there's been one president in Russia since 1999. There's been 6 presidents in Ukraine since 1999. That's how you define a democracy and a dictatorship. And then to me personally, I was in Kiev just the day before the invasion. I left on the last day. What I saw in Ukraine is a people together, the leadership, the people on the street, fighting together to save their country and to save their future with patriotism, with a look to the past, to their traditions, to their legacy, trying to save the Ukrainian legacy from the ravages of imperialism, I would think, maybe in my naivete, that this would be something that would appeal very closely to Indians, and that they would see here something similar and something they could emotionally connect with. So not even about morality and values, but about emotion. And so it's surprising. I know that India is a big country and there are opinions of all tastes. And even in this panel, there are many opinions. But on the whole, the sense I got was that there was a connection to the Russian point of view and not to the Ukrainian point of view. And it was difficult for me to understand. But I suspect there may even be some changes happening now, particularly as Indians see that this is not a limited geopolitical strategic war. This is turning into a brutal war against civilians with maternity hospitals being bombed. And curiously, it's the cities that are made up of ethnic Russians, Russian speakers like Kharkiv and Mariupol, that are being bombed and destroyed, and Russia is killing Russians in Ukraine. So it's very difficult to have any other opinion than to be stunned, shocked, morally shocked, emotionally shocked by what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
But Bruno, if I can draw you out a little further, do you think it's a larger than life issue because it's a war in Europe? We've had many bombings and many civilians killed. I mean, if we were having this discussion, but for the pandemic and the JLF having to be postponed, if we were having this discussion 3 months earlier, we would have been talking about Afghanistan. So is it different because it's European, as some people seem to suggest that these are, whites killing whites, therefore it has a different connotation around it, or is it actually different because it's the question of underdog versus a superpower or a great power?
I mean, in my writings, I was extremely critical of the American policy in Afghanistan. And I think one of the aspects was the way the US in that case seemed blind to Indian interests. And I think there was some people that were upset here, and with good reason. But still, it was a different case because in the end, Taliban took over, and we may be very worried about the future of Afghanistan, and in India particularly about the consequences that could have for terrorism in Kashmir. But in the end, it wasn't an invasion by a foreign country. I think the issue is morally clear in the case of Ukraine and Russia. This time around, Russia didn't even come up with a pretext. We don't know what the cause was. There wasn't even any pretext. They don't seem to care anymore about that. In Afghanistan, of course, it's a question about whether the Taliban are different or not different. And it's still too early to have a conclusion about that. But I'm on the side of those who are very skeptical that the Taliban will be different from the first time around.
Can I come in?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, so this whole thing of whether the Europeans are far more racist or the Americans are racist is something that has been coming up these last few days, and you probably follow the Western press as well, Bruno, because you've had a lot of journalists saying that, this is for the first time since the Second World War that people with blue eyes and blonde hair are being killed, right? Now, we're not putting you in the spot. You're not responsible for that kind of racist rhetoric. But the fact remains that when Iraq was invaded in 2003, the United States went against the Security Council and went into Iraq. They didn't really care whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not. I mean, listen, Saddam Hussein was a dictator. He may have been a dictator to his own people. He was probably killing every Iraqi in sight, but that's not your business. And if it is your business, then I think Europeans and the Americans should come out in a much more even keel and perhaps say that all wars are bad. You can't pick and choose your wars and say, this is good and that's not good.
Well, very well said. And but just to pick up on what Jyoti said about how Europe and the United States sees wars from their particular point of view, if we see what is happening in Ukraine today, Vijay, in terms of our point of view, India, but also South Asia, the enormous impact this is going to have on our economic recovery. What do you think are the takeaways for this? I mean, we are deeply concerned about Chinese aggression in our region, India especially, because we face an ongoing situation on the borders. But are there longer term takeaways for this from this situation for us, which we have to be watchful about?
Raghavan, I think there's no country watching this conflict closer than China. And they are seeing whether Russia will be allowed to get away with even the limited objective of liberating the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk regions and of keeping the Crimea. The whole strategic outlook of China has changed in the last 15 years. It's no longer the defense of the homeland that is important. It is now the defense of the common adjacent areas. This is a word used with the Russians in the joint statement of the 4th of February, which effectively means that in the southwestern corner, the Himalayan states become legitimate areas for China to build political influence and, if necessary, to fight a war on, so that the war doesn't come to their homeland. So from our perspective, therefore, we have to study the conflict in the Ukraine very carefully from both sides, but also pay attention to what China thinks and how it perceives what has happened in Ukraine. It's really got two objectives there. One is, of course, to see how it can harden its own economy, because it is seeing the devastation that the total financial war is having on the Russian economy. And the second is to see how it can apply the lessons of the Ukraine to certain territories that it claims because of some vague historical notion a few centuries ago. And that, of course, applies to us as well. So I think from our perspective, there is a need to study the way the Chinese are looking at this and to prepare ourselves for it.
So do you feel that if we looked at the war in Europe from a more limited India-China perspective, our position would be somewhat different, because we have to be watchful about what China may do about territories it has historical, quote unquote, historical claims to?
Yeah, I think, well, our position has always been that we respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think that's important. And we have reiterated this principle, by the way, even where the Ukraine is concerned. It's not that India has taken a different position there as it has when our own problems are involved. China, on the other hand, has a set of principles and its practice is entirely different. And to give you just one example, if our company goes and drills for oil in the South China Sea, it's a violation of their sovereignty. But if they build a road in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, it becomes their contribution to regional economic stability. So I guess principles are rather flexible on that.
Yes. Mahfuz, would you come in on this? I mean, in many ways, Bangladesh will have a slightly different perspective because you have two large neighbors, China and India. How do you see?
Definitely, you see, we at the moment have the closest of relationship with India, and I celebrate it. I'm a freedom fighter. I'm a personal witness to what India, Indian people, and Indian army did for our liberation. So my feelings are both emotional and historic. We really want to see India prosper. But on the other hand, for our prosperity, we also think that India-China relationship to improve is imperative. Now, I may be again being idealistic. There could be many, many nuanced and direct layers of problems between China and India. But if we are really talking about the Asian century, I think India and China are the pivots on which the economy, the prosperity of Asia will depend. For India and China to get more and more, into a conflict relationship is neither good for India nor for China. I can't speak, but definitely not for Bangladesh. We would like a region where Bangladesh could have the best relationship with India and a very practical relationship with China, which we do at the moment. And I thank Sheikh Hasina for it. We need no more conflict in South Asia. And of course, China has been aggressive in their last border clash, which is, they shouldn't have done it. And India has, I think, dealt with it in a very mature manner. But as a neighbor of India and a close proximity of China, we from Bangladesh feel that everything should be done. No stone should be left unturned in improving India-China relationship. It will be a vital, positive interest. And if it deteriorates, it will be of great consequence. And let me tell you my own experience about it, that as I have seen Pakistan evolve, Pakistan's security concern basically enveloped its every other concern. If you have to go on a conflict track with China, you will have to spend more on your military, your intelligence will be much higher, and gradually military say on civilian affairs. How much resources do you allocate for your security and how much for social development? All of these questions will come again. And India has a lot of challenges on the social sector. So as a neighbor, my wholehearted wish, intention, prayer, if you like, is that China and India comes to some sort of a workable agreement. They may not be able to solve all their problems, but definitely not go on a conflict path.
So thank you very much. Very well put. And what you're saying in brief is that national interest is much more than national security.
Yes, definitely.
And there are many other components to national interest than national security. Now that's very well put. But Jyoti, you've been following South Asia for decades, as also Indian foreign policy for decades. Do you think the Ukraine situation will change in any way approaches towards regional cooperation, towards India-China relations, or is it just a distant event to which we have to react?
So two things. I think, first of all, the Russia-Ukraine crisis will have its impact on Indian foreign policy, I think in two ways. The first is that it could, Mr. Gokhale said China is watching this conflict very, very closely to see how and whether Russia is going to be able to, whether it will succeed in its invasion of Ukraine or not. Similarly, I think while Indians are holding their nose at what Putin is doing, I think New Delhi is also drawing the same lessons. How far is Russia and how far is Putin going to be allowed to go? That's the first. And then, you can say that, well, under the Modi government, you've had surgical strikes in 2016. You've also had in 2019 the strikes in Balakot. Nobody asked any permission for that. I think the Prime Minister felt justified because there was an attack in Pulwama, and we know the history about that. But the fact is that the strikes took place for the first time in 50 years since the Bangladesh war. India went into another country. Now, could the Russian invasion of Ukraine, could India draw other lessons from that invasion of Ukraine? So I think that's the first. The second point is that I think this will also push India, or not push India, but I think India will draw much more closely towards the Americans. I think the fact that you don't like what the Russians are doing, now that you've 20,000 Indian students are out, but in some ways, the whole diversification of your arms business will now, I think India will perhaps lean more closely towards the US or the Western-led bloc. And on the South Asia question, I don't think that this is going to push for more peace towards South Asia, especially if the India-Pakistan issue. I mean, the SAARC summit has been hanging fire for the last 6 years. But I think the Indians will separate the South Asia story from that in Europe.
If I may come in at this stage, that I think there is an American agenda to further the distance between India and China. I mean, they don't want to see this cooperation grow. It is not to their interest. Contrarily, I cannot understand why, let's say, these very developed countries shouldn't see through this agenda. It will be to American interest to draw India towards it and away from China, and push India, because somebody said in the other session that Americans are fighting the Russian till the last Ukrainian soldier. They will also fight the Chinese with the last Indian soldier, perhaps, God forbid. But we should be very aware of that very much.
Well, thank you very much. Bruno Maçães, if I may come back to you. In South Asia, we have struggled with regional cooperation for decades, within SAARC, with other platforms. And in many ways, the European Union and what happened in Europe post the Second World War, and especially after 1992, was held up as a kind of standard. So where did Europe get it wrong in terms of its security architecture, in terms of thinking about Russia and thinking about North America, to end up in a situation like it has in Ukraine? Because clearly, when we talk about regional cooperation with South Asia, we will talk perhaps more about ASEAN now than about the European Union.
Well, we had these misguided ideas about world politics. We started to believe that trade and economic cooperation would solve every problem. We didn't have a security-based approach. In fact, we seemed to dislike it. We didn't get the right interpretations of events in the past. There was a crisis already in Ukraine in 2014, and again, there was a lot of complacency. There was this idea that Europe lived in a postmodern age where conflict and the military were not important anymore. There was excessive reliance on the United States. I think that's an important lesson here in South Asia as well, and for India as well. If in the future, God forbid, you're involved in a serious major war with China, it is going to be about Indian resources, and you shouldn't necessarily trust the United States to come over and solve the problem. Europeans became entirely reliant on America for their security. And now there's a very traumatic transition from that world of trade, economic exchange, reliance on America, into a world where we have a major war on our borders. I'm from Portugal. Ukraine is closer to Munich than Portugal is to Munich. So this is really inside Europe, a major war that could become even more significant and could expand to its borders. So clearly a different world, and we didn't prepare for it adequately. And that's, I think, perhaps a valuable lesson for India. Always expect the worst, always prepare for the worst.
So one way of preparing for the worst, for India that is not to expect anyone to come and get involved in your issues. People will make supportive statements, but we've seen what really happens. Do you think we factor that in sufficiently, Vijay? Or have we been overly dependent on the Americans?
No, I think right from the outset, even when we were really weak, I think we maintained a certain agency of our own, a certain autonomy. And I don't buy the argument that the Americans are separating India and China. It almost suggests as if the Indian people don't have any agency in the matter. Whereas, in fact, if you look at India's actions right from 1947, we've done a balancing act. Sometimes it's worked, sometimes it's been less successful. But I can't see a country like ours completely sort of caving in one direction or another. And if Bruno is right in saying that the Americans haven't come to the help of Europe, then it makes even more sense to see the Indian position on Ukraine as correct. Because in that case, it is not just the United States, but Russia we also need. And ultimately, any government works in the national interest. So my sense is that, first of all, we should not apply the European situation to us. We are a country which has a common boundary with every other neighbor, but no other neighbor has a common boundary with each other except Pakistan and Afghanistan. So there are big differences between South Asia and Europe. Within the South Asian context, I think that we have a fairly good policy which deals with the government of the day. We try to resolve problems, but it takes two to tango. And if we are going to look at what Russia did in Ukraine, we also have to take a look at what Ukraine has done with Russia. For 5 years, the Minsk agreement has dragged on. If the issue was, are you going to give a limited autonomy to Luhansk and Donetsk within the sovereignty of Ukraine? That was the Minsk agreement. And at least my perception is not only Ukraine, the Europeans have not delivered either. So I think we need to understand that the roots of this problem. I mean, I'm not saying that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a good thing. It may be, it's reprehensible, but let's not forget that there are causes for this. It's not just one side.
That's true. And if I can ask you, Mahfuz, now that given all that is happening in our wider region, and taking off from what Vijay said, do you think India's neighbors are sometimes less sensitive to Indian concerns than they should be, especially when it comes to China or other powers in the region?
I think there is a lot of limitations and flaws on the side of the Indian neighbors, definitely. That is definitely true. But on the other hand, I think there has to be greater sensitivity on the Indian side about why a neighbor is particularly anxious or on. Please don't forget the whole geography, in a sense, creates the insecurity. I mean, your size of the economy, military, population, geography, land, everything. So there is a natural, if you like, a tendency to suspect. But yes, I would agree with you that we need to be far more sensitive to a big power, perhaps, concept. But my conclusion is that I didn't say that India is following the American line. I said it is American agenda to distance you both. And it has to be your maturity to handle. But I think what we are faced with in South Asia is Western hypocrisy on one side and Putin's autocracy on the other side. And this is the dilemma that we are faced with. West with all their position, has been absolutely cynical, hypocritical, liars in the case of Iraq. However, it is a huge power and we have to deal with it. Russia, on the other hand, is under Putin, it has taken away all its democratic tendencies, if there was any. It is now, in a way, a bully of the sort. But again, as South Asia, we need to recognize it and deal with it. I agree with somebody who said, let's not push the bear into a corner and force them to react in a way that otherwise they would not have. However, we deal with Russia with sophistication. We deal with the US and with their other maturity. But let us not shy away from condemning, which is condemnable, which is an invasion of a smaller neighbor.
Well, we are back really to the same issue, but I want to move away from it for a little and talk a little more about India and South Asia. So, Jyoti, do you think where South Asian cooperation is concerned, and obviously there have been significant deficiencies in it over the years, the Ukraine crisis will act as some kind of a cement or in pushing things forward? Or are we going to see same of the more, as they say, and nothing really is going to move?
Oh, I think it's much more of the same. I'm not sure if things are going to move. I think India will draw a certain kind of lesson from the Russia-Ukraine crisis, but will not apply it to South Asia. And I'm completely on Mahfuz's side on 2 points. The first is on the morality argument. You know, Mahfuz, India has inherited the freedom struggle tradition. I think Indians understand the morality question quite well. Again, you know, in the 71 war. But I think what India also saw in all these past several decades is that the big powers said one thing and did another. So I think you've had to kind of negotiate through these very difficult situations. But on the South Asia question, again, I would agree with Mahfuz. I think India, in so many ways, you know, we perhaps don't understand our size. You know, in the north, Punjab has just won an election. The Aam Aadmi Party has just won an election in Punjab. You have a new party in power there. I remember even less than 10 years ago or 15 years ago, even after Kargil, we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Kargil war, which India won. Even after Kargil, the borders were open between India and Pakistan. But today, it's so much more congealed, so much more rigid. You cannot speak up, you cannot dissent. You know, I think the situation is far worse today than it was 15 years ago. And one of the reasons for that is that I think leaders in all our countries, whether it's in your country, my country, you know, Imran Khan, of course, we won't talk about his visit to Moscow because that was a complete disaster. But I think you know, there is a certain categorization of views that people, you know, you are a liberal, you are a libtard, you are this, you are that. People are no longer willing to listen to each other so much. So I think Prime Minister Modi, he's a very powerful Prime Minister. I think he has to reach out to those countries that countries like Pakistan. And
So you wanted to come? Yeah.
no, so just to
We should
quickly
reach
finish.
out to Pakistan.
Countries like Pakistan to
Yeah.
be able to create a South Asia, which is a space for all citizens to live in, to participate in, to travel across these spaces. I mean, we used to think of an economic union of South Asia, if not a political union. But I think we have stepped back many, many steps.
Okay, thank you. Bruno, you wanted to say something, and then there's Jyoti has provoked me into asking Vijay a question, which I'll do, and then ask audience questions. But yes, Bruno.
Just a very quick comment. So Americans and Europeans have a tendency when they have a problem to assume that everyone should regard the problem in the same way. They turn to India and you should regard this problem the way we do. And I find that ridiculous and certainly don't support it. If India has a problem with Europe and if it has a problem with the United States, it should be clear about that. And in the discussions should be, for example, should tell America that it's not joining the sanctions, because after all, Turkey didn't join the sanctions, China didn't join the sanctions, and India has economic concerns that it should defend. My only note is, don't take it out on Ukraine. Don't take it out on Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't deserve it. It's a country struggling for survival. And so in the UN, let's vote to defend Ukraine's rights to a future and to a country. And that has nothing to do with the United States, has nothing to do with Europe, just has to do with a small country where everyone, from the president to the smallest citizen on the street, is fighting for survival.
Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for audience questions. And while the mic goes there, Vijay, let me ask you, because Jyoti has provoked me a bit. Do you think civil society in India is far more critical about foreign policy than it is, for instance, in Europe? Because right now you see a complete consensus in North America and Europe about what is happening in Ukraine, while in India, whatever the government does, there is never a consensus about.
But look, I don't think it's critical of Indian foreign policy, but it's more concerned because ethnicities overlap. I mean, the United States was concerned about Northern Ireland because there was a significant Irish minority in the United States. They're poles apart, they're oceans apart. So I think it's normal if people are concerned about the Sri Lankan Tamils or the Hindus in Punjab or, anybody. These are overlapping ethnicities. Civil society will take a position, but government has to act in the national interests. Civil society is acting with a different set of considerations in mind, and we can't therefore expect a congruity between the two.
Thank you. There's a question there. Yes, madam. Yeah.
People are speaking about India's abstention from, voting for Ukraine as it is. I just wanted to ask, was the resolution stopped just because India abstained? It did not. But given our situation and our dynamics with Russia, I think we did not have an option to vote for the resolution. So I think, we have to see our own political situation also. India is responsible to its citizens as well as people, people in the world and everybody who is persecuted. But first duty is towards its own citizens. And
Thank you. Yes, everyone would agree with that India has to look after its own interests first.
India and Pakistan, I would want to know how US reacts to that situation. Even in that eventuality, that would clarify.
No, we can deal with Pakistan on our own and in a separate session. So
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So I was just taking a cue from what ma'am had been saying. Repeatedly, Ukraine has gone against India inside the UN as far as resolutions for Kashmir, or be it even the nuclear tests that were conducted at the time of Prime Minister Vajpayee. So I think that, first of all, it's always, as far as political relations go, tit for tat. So Ukraine has on multiple times blocked India's resolutions at the UN for Ukraine. Number two, for as far as the American goes, and the Americans have always, the bigger picture has been always oil. For the attack on Kuwait, it wasn't for liberating Kuwait, it was saving Kuwait, it was for oil. let's get their oil. Then Iraq. Iraq, it was always for the oil of Iraq. It wasn't about Saddam Hussein being.
Thank you. Yes, we've got the question. Thank you. Now we've got two questions. Any comments from you, Mahfuz?
I really didn't hear you.
You know, I don't think that is those are the considerations that the government of India took in taking the decision on the voting. This may be the view of some people, but we acted because there were Indian citizens there, because we have grid relations with Russia as well as with Ukraine and the West, and because I think the situation is still evolving. And I do want to sort of comment on Bruno's view that we had to take a position. The fact of the matter is, did the Europeans take a position when Libya was being bombed, when Syria was being bombed, when Iraq was attacked? So, you know, you can't have double standards. You can't say somebody's sovereignty being violated is all right because it serves my interest, but somebody else's sovereignty is an international crime.
So Europe should not have double standards. Yes, question at the back.
That's what I meant when I said hypocrisy.
Hi, my name is Chintan. This question is for Ambassador Raghavan. Since India has helped with the evacuation of some Pakistani citizens from Ukraine, do you think some positive developments from the Pakistani side towards the Indian side?
So should we have done more with Pakistani students, or did we do? Well, no, I'm passing it on to my panel. I think they'll be better equipped. Vijay, do you think we should have done more? Or Jyoti, do you think we should have done more? Was the Ukraine crisis an opportunity for India to have done more with respect to other students from South Asia and Ukraine?
I think we evacuated a lot of
We did a lot. We did a fair amount.
I mean, you got 20,000 Indian students out. You got a few thousand Nepali students. Pakistani, I'm not sure. There perhaps were a few, but I think India got a lot of people out. And
Taking cue from there, I would like to bring it back to our region. I think whatever is the complications, whatever are the provocations, problems, we South Asian must cooperate much more. I mean, there is really no future without cooperation. And in that scene, India is the natural leader. I mean, there is no question about it. I may differ in many, many ways, but India's responsibility is higher because of your maturity, your ancient civilization, and your position. Now, is India playing that role as a visionary, as a conciliator, as somebody who really is a trigger, a catalyst in building a future? But just one moment, sir. I would like to say that, I forgot.
No, so important point that there is an onus on India to take the lead in South Asia.
Yeah, what I was saying to say, sir, that everybody talks about national interest. Obviously, India must pursue its national interest. So must Bangladesh. But can we take a little more time in defining what is national interest?
And can national interest be synonymous with regional interest? You know, is South Asia a space that we can all own?
Absolutely.
So this is, I don't think anyone would disagree that the Ukraine crisis, a crisis in Europe, is an example for us to cooperate more in our own region. Last question there. Yes, at the back, right at the back. Very quickly, please.
Hello, this question is to Mr. Bruno. You said that Europe has always concentrated on its trade and economic interests more, and it should have approached strategically or more from a security point of view. Don't you think that India not taking a stance on Ukraine is actually concentrating on its strategic interests rather than being controversial on a world forum?
It's with great hesitation that I talk about Indian self-interest. I'm not the best person to understand Indian self-interest, but I just very cautiously, it's not clear to me that it's Indian self-interest to be too attached to a Russia that will soon become a global pariah, that will soon have no access to semiconductors to produce its sophisticated weaponry. So if you want to be reliant on Russian weaponry, keep that in mind. On the question of regional integration, the lesson from Europe, to the extent that there's a lesson, is remember that security comes before trade and economics. And if you don't solve the security issues, the trade and economic integration is not going to help you when the problems arise.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're almost out of time. Vijay, we have half a minute and one last question. What does this mean for Russia-China relations? Will their coming closer together, is it a bigger problem for us?
I think the principal Chinese concern is to keep Putin in power. No other government is going to be as accommodative to China as President Putin is. So it will mean that there will be a closer relationship. There's no doubt about that.
And we have to live with that. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We are out of time. Thank you. Wonderful audience and wonderful questions.
Thank you.
We would like to thank Mr. Mahfuz, Anam, Ms. Jyoti, Malhotra, Dr. TCA Raghavan, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, and Mr. Bruno Maçães for this riveting and interesting discussion. And we hope to see you in the future sessions of the 15th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India. Thank you so much for attending this session, and we hope to see you in all of the next sessions that we have to offer.
Big crunch. Okay, maybe I was wrong to let a man of few words tear me up in the David Bowie dawn. I am reduced to a shriek now. Shrink away, little urchin. You too, my null.